So we're answering the question, what books belong in the Old Testament? Now it's the same test, right? It's the same miracle test that was used to determine which books belong in the Old Testament. Miracles. And it's always ideal, right? We discussed this last week. It's always ideal if you could see the miracles with your own eyes. And I think that's true of anything, any event that is claimed to have happened. If you see it with your own eyes, that's going to increase your confidence. But trustworthy eyewitness testimony is also sufficient. I mean, just think of all the things that you believe that you haven't seen with your own eyes, but you're believing them based on credible sources, right? So scientific experiments done by professional scientists, you didn't see the experiments with your own eyes, but you're trusting, right, a credible source. Similarly, I think we can build a case, and we did last week, several weeks, we've been building this case, based on the miracles of Jesus and his disciples, and all of the eyewitness testimony sources that we have, multiple independent eyewitness sources of those miracles. So when it comes to the Old Testament, there's two options. You can do this in two ways. The first one is to evaluate the evidence for the miracles for each person in the Old Testament. Each person during the Old Testament times who claimed to have a message from God. And this, in fact, was the test that was used by God's people at that time. So think of the Old Testament era, right, before Jesus. We know that the Israelites, God's people during Old Testament times, they primarily used the miracle test to know if a prophet was a true prophet. And you can see this in Exodus 4, you can see this in Deuteronomy 18. And so the people of the time used the miracle test to ascertain what messages were really from God or not. Now we do have some of this historical record. We can dig into this historical evidence. However, it gets a bit difficult, especially with some of the authors of the Old Testament, because we're talking about things that happened thousands and thousands of years ago. I mean, the New Testament authors were 2,000 years ago, but some of the Old Testament authors go back 1500 BC, so we're talking what, 3,500 years. And that makes the looking at the historical evidence that much more difficult because it took place so long ago. Here's some things that we do know, though. Even though looking back through this history, trying to determine what books belong in the Old Testament via this first process, here are some things that we do know if we want to go down that path. We do know that the Jewish community, even during Old Testament times, would argue from time to time over which books were really from God or not. And most of the time, the argumentation or the debate within the Jewish community had to do with historical evidence for miracles. Because again, if that was the litmus test, then that was what they focused on. So even within the Jewish community, some of the debated books were Ezekiel, Proverbs, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And so we do have in the historical record evidence of, even within the Jewish community during Old Testament times, there being some debate as to whether these books were really from God or not. But the Jewish community came to the conclusion that there was good, solid historical evidence that the miraculous was associated with these books, and so they included them in their canon. Of course, they don't call their canon the Old Testament, right? They would refer to it in other terms, and we'll see some of those terms later on. But I'll keep using the term Old Testament because that's what we refer to. That's how we refer to those 39 books. Now, the biggest split between Old Testament folks were between the Jewish community and the Samaritans. So you remember the Samaritans, they're discussed often in the New Testament. The Samaritans were an interesting group of people. They were originally Israelites from the northern kingdom that intermarried with other people groups. And so the southern Israelites, those from Judah, kind of looked down at them almost as half-breeds because they were only partially Jewish in their ethnicity. So there's a lot of, racism towards the Samaritans. And we see Jesus being very loving and kind to the Samaritans. Think of John 4 and his conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well. But interestingly, the Samaritans believed that only the books from Moses were really messages from God. And so we do have some historical record of those two groups and their reasons why they came to their different conclusions. An Old Testament scholar by the name of R.K. Harrison, if you want to dive into this material further, he suggests that the Jewish canon was solidified probably around the 3rd or 4th century BC. So among the Jewish community, that's when things were solidified, similar to what we would say about the New Testament, that was solidified in the 300s during those councils and the early church leaders doing that research to see what was really authenticated, affirmed by the first century apostles. Similarly, in the Jewish community, probably around the 3rd or 4th century BC is when the Jewish canon became solidified. And the best evidence indicates that the Jewish community settled on these 39 books that we, as Protestants, call the Old Testament. Now, if you look at a Jewish Bible, right, again, it's not going to be called the Old Testament, but if you look at the Jewish Bible, it's not going to be numbered in 39 books because they order them a bit differently and they combine some of the books that we split apart. But if you just look at the material, right, it's the exact same material. So it's the exact same information, what we would say the 39 books of the Old Testament. So if you take, even today, a Jewish Bible, go and buy a Jewish Bible from the store and compare it to your Old Testament, it will be exactly the same. Definitely by the time you get to AD 400, there's no doubt whatsoever that the Jewish Bible contains this exact same material that it is in our 39 Old Testament books. Now, what makes this first approach difficult, as we've been saying, is that some of the historical evidence goes back thousands and thousands of years. And so it's difficult, especially with some of the Old Testament books, to evaluate the miracles that were associated with them. So there's a second option. Instead of going this route to confirm the Old Testament books and which ones, if they're really messages from God or not, you can go to this second route. And this is to evaluate the evidence for Jesus and his disciples' miracles, and then the historical evidence concerning what they said were really messages of God given before their time. So think about it this way. I'll walk you through the thought process. If we confirm that the New Testament books really are messages from God, and that's what we did last week, right? Then it's kind of like, if you do that, you get the Old Testament thrown in for free. It's kind of like a buy one, get one free situation, right? Because think about it, if the New Testament is a message from God, inside the New Testament, it says that the Old Testament were messages from God. And so in other words, you've got a message from God, i.e. the New Testament, telling you that the Old Testament is also from God. So that's why I say it's kind of a buy one, get one free scenario. So here's how you can lay out the argument using the second strategy, if you will, for the Old Testament. This is an argument for the Old Testament canon based on the miracles of Jesus and his apostles. And the reason why a lot of people choose this second path is because it's easier to look at the historical evidence for Jesus and his disciples' miracles, because we only have to go back 2,000 years for that instead of 3,500 years for some of the Old Testament books. So here's a way to make a case for the Old Testament canon through the miracles of Jesus and his disciples. So premise one, there's good historical evidence for the miracles of Jesus and his apostles. We've looked at this already. Premise two, these miracles affirm that Jesus and the apostles were true prophets, that they really had messages from God, which are the books of the New Testament. And it's these messages from God, given by Jesus and the apostles, i.e. the New Testament, that affirm the Hebrew canon of the first century is really messages from God as well. So the question becomes, after you kind of understand this thought process and how this strategy or this argument works, the debate then comes, and this is what we'll spend a lot of the morning on, what exactly was the Hebrew canon in the first century? And we're going to look at some of the historical evidence for that. Okay, before we get there though, we could ask this question, or a skeptic might ask us this question. How do Jesus and his disciples say that the Old Testament is from God? Because it's not like if you go to the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples don't give us a list of 39 books, right? That would be nice. Then we would know exactly what they thought the Old Testament canon was. So how do we know what Jesus and disciples thought was the Old Testament? Well, one of the ways that we can know is that they quote from it often. They quote verses from the Old Testament and then refer to those quotes as being information from God. And so that gives us a clue that they're understanding that the Old Testament is from God. 90 times throughout the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples support their case, various cases, various arguments that they're making, and they support their conclusions by saying, "It is written," and then quote the Old Testament. Just one classic example of this is when Jesus was tempted by Satan. Right? What did Jesus say? He said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." And then in that encounter with Satan, he goes on to quote several verses from the Old Testament. Words from the mouth of God. Obviously, Jesus and his disciples didn't use the term Old Testament, but there was a term being used in the first century that was a common way to refer to their canon. A way to refer to their collection of books that they thought were from God. This was a phrase that was used from very early in the first century till all the way into the 10th century AD. And this phrase is the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So instead of saying the Old Testament, they would say the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And that would be a way for them to refer to that collection of books that they thought were from God. This is a well-known phrase used for centuries to refer to the Jewish canon. And you can see Jesus and the disciples using that phrase in the New Testament. Just one example is Luke 24:44. The key question is, what did the Jews think of as the Jewish canon in the first century? And this is where there's a little bit of a debate, but I think you'll see as we look at the historical evidence, there's good solid evidence that we have that the Jewish canon, their understanding of what was really from God, Scripture at that time, is the exact same thing that we think of in our current Protestant Bibles of those 39 Old Testament books. And we'll look at some of that evidence.